Have you ever wondered why some European cities seem to whisper secrets when we walk through its ancient streets? It's not just historic charm. There is something more there. Something silent, repeated, hidden in plain sight. If you feel that certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what you needed to hear today. Imagine that the history we learn is not an open book, but a safe closed by symbols, rituals, and codes that crossed centuries without ever being explained to the common public. As kings fell, empires changed, and wars redrawing maps, certain signs remained intact, like marks left by who really understood the game of power. Europe was not built just with stone, blood, and political treaties. She was designed as a large symbolic text, cathedrals aligned with stars, squares forming perfect geometric figures, statues that strangely repeat gestures similar in different countries. None of this is random. Symbols are language. And who controls language controls the way people think, feel, and obey. Since antiquity, true power has rarely presented itself directly. He prefers the invisible, prefers to operate in the collective unconscious, where questions are not asked and standards are accepted as normal. Symbols fulfill exactly this role. They communicate orders, hierarchies, and pacts without the need for words. Only those who know how to read understand. Maybe you've never stopped to look at an ancient stained glass window, a royal coat of arms, or a monument in the center of a European capital with real attention. But these elements were created to be seen again and again, generation after generation, until their messages became part of the collective psyche. The curious thing is that, even without understanding them rationally, we feel them. There is a reason why certain symbols spark immediate reverence, fear, or fascination. They don't speak to logic. They speak to something deeper, something Carl Jung would call archetypes. Ancient structures of the human mind that respond to shapes, colors, and patterns specific. Whoever mastered this knowledge dominated crowds without raising their voice. Throughout this video, we will not talk about empty theories or cinematic fantasies. Let's talk about real patterns, repeated throughout European history, connecting orders, discrete, architecture, religion, and power. You can agree or disagree, but if you see these codes, you will hardly be able to ignore them again. And now I want to make you a silent invitation. Notice how you feel while listen. If any part of this arouses discomfort, a curiosity that is difficult to explain, write just one word in the comments. Why? Don't explain. Just register. Why sometimes the first sign of awakening is realizing that you have started to see. But if symbols are a language, who wrote this message spread across Europe? Who decided where each stone would be placed, and why? And more importantly, is this code still active today, influencing the world in which do we live without realizing it? There's a strange feeling when we realize that maybe we weren't taught how to do things. Right questions. Not because someone directly lied, but because certain topics were pushed into silence. Symbols do not disappear. They just change context. They go from temples to palaces, from palaces to banks, from benches to screens. And they remain there, watching. When you start to notice repetitions, the world seems different. More organized, more intentional, and perhaps more controlled than we imagined. What would you do if you discovered that much of what you feel, fear, or respect was programmed centuries ago? This journey is just beginning, and the next layer of this code will reveal how Europe itself was designed to communicate power without ever ask permission. When we look at the map of Europe with ordinary eyes, we see borders, countries, roads, and capitals. But when we observe with symbolic attention, another drawing appears, invisible to most. A drawing made of alignments, proportions, and repetitions that span centuries. This board was not created for soldiers, but for consciences. Each important city occupies a strategic position not only geographically, but also symbolic. Like chess pieces, they fulfill specific functions within a game. Much bigger. Rome, Paris, London, Vienna, and Prague did not grow just by chance historical. They were chosen, reinforced, and preserved as centers for a mission of influence. Influence that is not only measured in armies or riches, but in meaning. Whoever defines the meaning defines the direction. From deep collective human history. Notice how ancient trade routes coincide with religious and political paths. They not only transported goods, but invisible ideas, symbols, and pacts. A geometry was one of the most powerful tools in this process. Straight lines connecting temples, palaces, and squares create recognizable patterns for initiates. Triangles, crosses, and circles appear repeatedly when we connect points on the map. These forms are not neutral. They carry ancient meanings linked to order, control, and transcendence. Most people never consciously realize this, but the brain recognizes patterns even when the mind doesn't understand. This recognition silent generates familiarity, respect, and symbolic submission. This is how a board makes it effective, without needing explicit orders. It influences choices, emotions, and profound collective decisions, without being questioned by the majority. Absolute. When we talk about the board, we also talk about invisible rules. These rules, they determine who can ascend, who must obey, and who never appears. Architecture was used as a silent manual for these rules. Imposing cathedrals diminish the individual and exalt authority. Open squares create a feeling of surveillance and exposure. Tall towers symbolize connection with something above, unreachable. Until street orientation influences human and psychological flow. None of this is a coincidence aesthetics. These are choices that shape behavior over generations. When you born in such an environment, he learns the rules without realizing it. It is symbolic education constant, repeated daily until it looks natural. And what seems natural rarely is questioned. This is the silent power of the historic European chessboard, working to this day before us. Maybe now you're thinking that this all sounds exaggerated. But notice one detail important. These patterns appear in countries that have been enemies for centuries. Thus, they repeat similar symbols. How would this be possible without a common array? The answer is not in temporary governments. It is in older power structures and lasting. Structures that think in centuries, not mandates. For them, wars are just adjustments on the board. The drawing remains. Pieces move around. This vision, it completely changes the way we see European history, not as a chaotic sequence, but as a project. A project that uses symbols as language, and those who don't learn this language play without understanding the rules, and always lose without knowing why, from the beginning. At this point, it is normal for an inevitable question to arise. Who taught this language symbolic, and who ensured that it was preserved? For a board to exist, someone you need to know the game, and most importantly, it only needs to teach a few. The story officer rarely speaks of these invisible instructors, but their traces are everywhere. In repeated symbols, in unlikely alignments, in strange decisions. When something repeats itself too much, it stops being chance. The European board is proof of this, and we are just starting to observe it properly. In the next block, we will go down one level deeper. Let's talk about the players who knew these rules. Discrete groups, silent oaths, and shared symbols, and then everything starts to make sense. Unsettling. Do you think these orders still exist today? Think about it. When we realize that Europe was designed as a symbolic board, inevitable question, who knew the rules of this game? Because symbols are not organized themselves. They require guardians, people or groups capable of understanding, preserve, and transmit knowledge that could not be popular. Throughout history in Europe, these guardians did not present themselves as visible rulers. They operated behind the scenes, influencing kings, shaping religions, and guiding decisions that seemed spontaneous, but they weren't. The most efficient power never exposes itself. He hides in rituals, oaths, and silence, and that's how discrete orders were born. These orders did not function like ordinary societies. They were structured into levels. Each level only had access to part of the information. The initiate learned basic symbols, coded stories, gestures, and keywords. Only after trying loyalty, discipline, and understanding, advanced to deeper layers. This guaranteed two essential things: control and continuity. Even if one member failed, the greater knowledge remained protected, not in public books, but in the minds of few prepared. The knowledge was alive, transmitted orally, symbolically, and ritually. This way he survived wars, the fall of empires, and religious persecution. Where books burned, symbols remained, invisible to those who didn't know how to look. Perhaps you have heard of these orders as if they were exaggerated legends, but think calmly. At a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, whoever mastering symbols, numbers, and geometry had an immense advantage. These orders understood astronomy, sacred mathematics, primitive human psychology, and the power of narratives. They knew that controlling the collective imagination was more efficient than control territories. Therefore, they infiltrated key institutions: churches, universities, royal councils, and craft corporations. They did not rule directly, they advised, and whoever advises often decides. The oaths of these orders were not simple moral promises, they were pacts symbolic. By swearing, the initiate agreed to protect knowledge even against his own life. This may sound extreme today, but back then, knowledge was absolute power. Revealing it to the wrong person meant chaos. At least, that's what they believed. Therefore, the punishment for breaking the silence was severe. Not just physical, but symbolic. O traitor was erased. Your name, your memory, your lineage, as if I never had existed. This fear kept the structure intact. Silence was not imposed, was internalized. Over time, these orders learned something even more sophisticated. It wasn't enough to save knowledge. It was necessary to spread it in a fragmented way. So, even if you found a part, you would never have the whole. A symbol here, a ritual there, a construction in a specific place, everything separated by distance, time, and context. Only those who, if you had the complete map, you would be able to understand the system. That's why we see similar symbols in different places in Europe, but rarely explained in direct way. They are loose pieces of a giant puzzle, a puzzle that it wasn't meant to be ridden by everyone. This method created a powerful illusion, the feeling that knowledge was accessible, when in fact it was incomplete. Most only saw the surface. The initiates saw layers, and the deeper you went, the fewer people there were at that level. This generated an invisible but extremely effective hierarchy. Who was at the top needed to appear. His ideas were already spread, reproduced, and defended by others. The control was automatic, cultural, psychological, lasting. Now a disturbing question arises. If these orders existed for centuries, did they just disappear? Or did they just change their shape, name, and appearance? Smart structures do not dissolve. They adapt, abandon old symbols when necessary, and adopt new ones. They maintain the essence, but update the language. Perhaps today you will see these symbols in unexpected places. In logos, buildings modern, public ceremonies, and apparently neutral speeches. The game continues, just with a different aesthetic. And if this is true, what else do we inherit from these orders without understand? In the next block, we will enter even more sensitive territory. Let's observe the religious and architectural symbols that have crossed centuries, shaping faith, behavior, and power. Has spirituality always been just spiritual? Or was it also sophisticated symbolic control engineering? When you enter a temple and you feel something without knowing why, who is really talking to you? Think this before moving on. Entering an ancient European cathedral causes a feeling that is difficult to explain. The body. He slows down, his voice drops, his gaze rises almost automatically. It's not just faith, it is architecture working on the mind. Every arch, every column, every beam of light was designed to provoke submission, reverence, and internal silence. These spaces were not built only to house prayers, but to shape behavior. The religion Europeanism has always been accompanied by precise symbolic engineering. Where speech does not reaches, the form reaches, and she teaches without words. Since the Middle Ages, religious leaders have understood something fundamental. Symbols reach where arguments fail. The cross, the vertical light, The sound of the bell and the incense are not you. Spiritual accessories. These are sensory triggers. They organize collective emotions, create belonging, and establish hierarchy. When someone enters a temple, they understand immediately who is small and who is big. Space communicates authority before any sermon. This symbolic language went through centuries practically intact, because it works directly in the human unconscious. It doesn't need to be explained to be obeyed. Sacred architecture also teaches by contrast. The darkness of the entrances prepares the visitor to the light of the altar. The long path reinforces the idea of merit. The high ceiling, it distances the human from the divine, creating psychological distance. All of this builds a narrative silent. You need mediation to reach the sacred. And who controls mediation? Controls access, guilt, and salvation. Thus, faith is no longer just an internal experience, and becomes an organized power structure. But it wasn't just churches. Palaces, obelisks, central squares, and buildings' administrative offices repeat the same principles. Excessive symmetry conveys order. Stone massive conveys permanence. Wide stairs force the body to submit to the rhythm of power. Even those who don't believe in anything feel something when climbing these steps. The body learns before the mind. This is the genius of the architectural symbol. It governs sensations without asking for rational permission. Over time, these religious and civil symbols began to mix. What was a temple became a political center. What was ritual became protocol. Colors, shapes, and gestures migrated from faith for the state. This created an invisible continuity between religion and government. The citizen obey today with the same body posture taught centuries ago in the sacred space. Head down, gaze attentive, respectful silence. Power only changed the discourse, not the symbolic language. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is the realization that these symbols have not lost strength. They've just been normalized. When something is seen every day, it ceases to be questioned. Architecture teaches slow, steady, and deep obedience. Not out of fear immediate, but out of emotional habit. This is why revolutions change governments, but buildings rarely change. Overthrowing symbols is more dangerous than overthrowing leaders. Those who understand this protect the form before the idea. There are also more subtle, almost imperceptible symbols. Numbers repeated on facades, specific proportions, solar orientations, and alignments with religious dates. These details are not seen by the public, but they are felt. They create a sense of order, divine, of inevitable destiny. When something seems inevitable, it is not fought against. It is accepted. This was one of the greatest triumphs of European symbolic elites, transforming choice as human beings in the appearance of superior will. Thus, control does not feel like oppression, but protection. It doesn't feel like domination, but caution. And this is profoundly effective. Now think about the impact of this over generations. Children raised in these spaces, they learn who is in charge before learning to read. They learn to wait, to ask, to bow. The symbol educates faster than any school. Therefore, whoever controls the architecture controls the psychological future of a society. This understanding has not been lost, just has been refined. Today it appears in modern buildings, seats of power, and financial centers. The aesthetics have changed, but the logic remains identical. This understanding completely changes the way we see history. It's not about denying faith or demonizing architecture, but of understanding its psychological function. When symbols are used without awareness, they control. When they are understood, free. The problem is that almost no one is taught to notice them. Symbolic knowledge was taken from common education. All that remains is obedience aesthetics. This didn't happen by chance. It was a strategic choice. Because people who recognize symbols and stop reacting automatically. They get to choose. And choice is something that the invisible power has always tried to avoid in the masses. Without this consciousness, we repeat old gestures believing they are ours, while we follow paths traced long before our collective birth, without ever realizing who he actually held the invisible map of the entire hidden route. Before moving on, it's worth an honest pause. How many times have you felt respect, fear, or reverence without knowing why? How many collective decisions were accepted because they seemed too natural to question? These symbols do not just belong to the past. They remain active, silent, and effective. In the next block, we will play into something even more delicate. Lineages, blood, and invisible inheritances. The power that is not conquers, but is inherited. Are you ready to question whether some families always were you at the top? What if the true throne was never visible? There is a comfortable idea that power changes hands according to merit, intelligence, or strength. But European history reveals another layer, quieter and persistent. A layer where power is not conquered, but inherited. Not just in titles or properties, but in access. Access to symbols, rituals, alliances, and information that have never been available to the common public. These lineages did not depend on visible crowns. They have survived revolutions, religious changes, and the fall of empires. Because what they inherited was not just wealth, but strategic knowledge about how the world really works. Entire families were trained from birth to occupy key positions. Marriages were not romances, but fusions of influence. Last names worked like silent keys that opened invisible doors. Even when they lost power formal, these lineages maintained something more valuable: networks. Networks of favors, oaths, ancients, and crossed loyalties that crossed borders. While the people believed that, history progressed through ruptures. These families simply adapted, exchanging symbols, languages, and alliances as needed. The throne could fall. The structure remained intact. The concept of blood has always been central, not out of empty mysticism, but out of continuity. A lineage guaranteed that symbolic knowledge was passed without external interference. Children were educated to understand signs, respect invisible hierarchies, and recognize allies by behavior, not speech. Learning started early. What to many seemed like family tradition, to others was power training. And this training included something fundamental: the art of never appearing as true controller. Over time, these bloodlines learned to hide even better. Instead of kings, they became advisors. Instead of generals, they became financiers. Instead of religious leaders, became sponsors of the faith. Power migrated from the visible to the structural. Those who control structures don't need applause. It just needs the system continues to work in your favor. And he continued, century after century. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is to realize that these bloodlines do not see themselves as villains. For contrary, many sincerely believe that they are guardians of order, that the world chaos would result if knowledge were distributed indiscriminately. This belief justifies silence, exclusion, and control. When someone believes they are protecting the humanity of itself, any method becomes acceptable. This thought it has passed down generations as a distorted but deeply rooted moral legacy. Invisible inheritance also explains something curious. Certain people always seem to fall into foot. Even after scandals, bankruptcies, or public defeats, they return to the top with disconcerting ease. It's not luck. It's a network. It is symbolic lineage. It is the effect of belonging to a system that protects itself internally. To those outside, this seems injustice. For those inside, it's just normal operation. These families rarely talk about themselves. They prefer to sponsor ideas, movements, and causes. They become invisible by strategic choice. The name disappears, but the influence grows. While the public discusses visible figures, the real power watches in silence. This is the most valuable inheritance, the ability to act without being noticed, to shape decisions without signed documents, to influence the course of history without ever appearing in the book's didactic. When we understand this, the narrative of social mobility changes completely. It's just about individual effort. There are layers of access that have never been democratized. Symbols, codes, and networks continue to be transmitted as inheritance private, and those who are not born within them need to discover everything alone, belatedly, when the game has been going on for centuries. This does not mean that fate is sealed. It just means the board is more old and complex than we were told. Knowing this invisible heritage is not accepting submission, but regain consciousness. Because when power is inherited in silence, the first step to balance is to make it visible, and that starts with uncomfortable questions. If power crosses time through lineages, how does it remain active in the mind of common people? As inherited symbols continue to influence emotions, choices, and behaviors today. In the next block, we will reveal how the symbol turns into a psychological weapon, and how it acts within you, even when you believe he is free. Are you prepared to question what really guides your actions? Daily decisions? The most powerful symbol is not the one you recognize, but the one that acts without you notice. He doesn't shout, he doesn't threaten, he doesn't impose himself by force. It infiltrates, works in emotional, automatic, almost instinctive level. This is why throughout European history, symbols have always been treated as strategic instruments, not as simple cultural ornaments. Whoever understood the human mind understood something essential. The people are not moved by facts, but by meanings, and symbols are factories of meaning. From an early age, human beings learn to react before thinking. Shapes, colors, gestures, and spatial positions activate very old internal responses. Long before logic, there is the reflection. The symbol speaks to this reflection. It associates ideas with specific emotions: security, fear, authority, belonging. When this association is repeated throughout, over time, it becomes fixed. The person starts to react without questioning. This is how the symbol turns into a psychological weapon. Does not hurt the body, directs the mind. In Europe, this mechanism has been refined for centuries. Symbols of power were placed in strategic locations to be seen daily. Flags, coats of arms, statues, and government buildings are not just used to represent institutions. They condition behaviors. A citizen learns where he can go, how he should behave, and what that you must respect without anyone needing to explain. The symbol teaches silently. And the earlier this teaching begins, the deeper it becomes. Repetition is the key. An isolated symbol has little effect, but repeated thousands of. Sometimes it creates psychological reality. The child grows up seeing the same signs associated to the same emotions. Over time, she no longer questions it. Just sit. This collective conditioning is extremely effective because it feels natural. The people, they believe that their reactions are spontaneous, when in fact they have been trained by generations of continuous symbolic exposure. The most sophisticated thing about this weapon is that it works even when the original meaning is forgotten. Few today know the real meaning of many ancient European symbols, but it doesn't matter. The effect remains. The brain does not need to consciously understand to react. It just recognizes familiar patterns, and familiarity breeds trust. Trust breeds obedience. This cycle is simple, profound, and extremely difficult to understand. Break. Over time, this symbolic engineering went beyond physical space, migrated to documents, ceremonies, speeches, and even body gestures. The way leaders position, the tone of voice, the setting behind them. Everything is calculated to activate responses, specific emotions. Nothing is improvised. The rational message may change, but the symbolic remains constant. It is what sustains authority even when logic fails. Maybe you're starting to notice something uncomfortable. Many of your feelings regarding power, success, respect, and fear may not be entirely yours. They were induced, not by a specific person, but by an ancient symbolic system, and persistent. This doesn't mean you are weak. It means you are human, and the system was built exactly for humans. The good news is that every weapon loses power when it is recognized. The symbol only dominates while remaining invisible. When you learn to observe it, it stops acting automatically. A space appears between the stimulus and the reaction. In this space, the choose. And choice is what has always been denied to the masses. Therefore, knowledge symbolic was kept away from common education. Not by chance, but for strategy. Today, these symbols continue to be used, just in new guises. Logos, brands, digital interfaces, and media narratives repeat the same principles. The field battle mode has changed, but the weapon is the same. Whoever controls symbols controls attention. Whoever controls attention controls behavior. And whoever controls behavior controls the future. Now an inevitable question arises. If symbols are used as psychological weapons there are so long, who is holding this gun today? Who decides which symbols will be repeated, amplified, and normalized? In the next block we will bring this discussion for the present. Let's look at where these codes appear today and who benefits of them. Are you willing to see the modern world with different eyes? When we look at the world today, it is easy to believe that ancient symbols have lost their strength. Screens have replaced temples, algorithms have replaced kings, and speed seems to have the mystery dissolved. But that's just the surface. In fact, symbolic codes, they have never been so active. They just exchange the stone for the image, the public ritual for the daily habit, and the temple through the feed. Power has learned to adapt to time, not disappear. And today it operates on an even more intimate level. Attention. Contemporary symbols do not present themselves as sacred. They disguise themselves as neutral, functional, and modern. Minimalist logos, mirrored buildings, speeches, techniques, and narratives of progress carry the same old logic. Silent authority. Large financial centers are designed to intimidate without appearing aggressive. Headquarters power units use glass and steel to convey transparency while reinforcing distance. Everything communicates something, even when it says it doesn't communicate anything. The modern symbol is effective precisely because it seems empty. Repetition remains the main tool. A symbol seen once does not dominate, but when it appears every day, everywhere, it shapes perception. Brands have become identities. Ideas become indisputable truths. What is repeated enough ceases to be questioned, and whoever controls repetition controls the sense of normality. Today, this repetition is amplified by technology. Algorithms choose what you see, when you see it, and how often. This is not neutral. It is automated symbolic power. The ancient bloodlines understood this quickly. Many migrated from power. Territorial for informational power, they invested in communication, finance, technology, and narrative. They no longer need to govern countries. They govern flows, capital flows, data, and attention. Those who control flows do not need to appear. It just directs. And the world goes on believing that he chose freely. The most sophisticated thing about this control is that it presents itself as freedom. The person feels who chooses, who decides, who gives his opinion. But your options have already been symbolically filtered. Colors, words, frames, and stories are carefully selected to provoke specific responses. The symbol does not say do. He creates the environment where only one choice seems logical. This is much more efficient than direct enforcement. It's consensus manufactured. Perhaps you have already noticed how certain ideas become dominant almost overnight. For the day. How opinions are accepted without in-depth analysis. This doesn't happen by chance. There is prior symbolic work, a collective emotional preparation. When the right one is activated at the right time, the dough reacts in a predictable way. Not because it is manipulable, but because it shares the same inherited psychological triggers. Past has not died. It just changed the interface. This is where European history connects directly to the present. Old codes were abandoned. They were digitized. The board continues to exist, but now it moves at invisible speed. The pieces are no longer cities, but narratives. They are not armies, but collective emotions. Fear, desire, belonging, and urgency. Who knows activating these symbols controls decisions on a global scale without firing a single shot. This does not mean that everything is conspiracy or conscious evil. Many operators. These systems only reproduce inherited structures. They follow models that work. The danger lies in collective unconsciousness. When no one notices the symbol, no one questions it. And when there is no questioning, there is no real choice. Now stop for a moment. Observe your daily life. What catches your attention automatically? What sparks immediate trust? What generates rejection without reflection? These answers say more about the codes that surround you than about you. Recognizing this is not paranoia. It is perceptive maturity. We are reaching the most important point of this journey. If symbols still control flows, emotions, and decisions, what happens when you learn to see them? In the next and last block, let's close this cycle. Not with definitive answers, but with the essential question. The final code is not out. He is in you. And maybe the real freedom begins when you decide not to react automatically. Are you ready for this final silence? We have reached the point where history stops being just information and becomes a mirror. Everything we have seen so far, symbols, lineages, architecture, psychological power, is not it exists only outside of you. It exists within. The greatest secret in European history was never who controlled the codes, but where they actually operate. They don't just live in ancient stones, coats of arms, or imposing buildings. Live in the way you perceive the world, reacts to stimuli, and makes decisions without realizing why. The final code is not hidden in safes. It's in the conscience. For centuries, real power was keeping people reacting automatically, respecting what seems respectable, fearing what seems threatening, wishing for what seems desirable. The symbol fulfilled this role perfectly. As you reacted, someone chose. While you felt, someone directed. The most efficient control never needed constant violence. It needed only silent repetition. And it worked because no one taught you to pause. But there is a rare moment, an instant when something changes, not outside but inside. It is when you notice the symbol before reacting, when you notice the pattern before following it. At that moment, the code loses strength, because it depends on automatic, the symbolic power. It only works when you don't know it's there. When you know, a space is born, and that space is freedom. This freedom is not noisy. She doesn't scream. She doesn't confront. She doesn't destroy anything. She observe, question, choose. This is why she has always been considered dangerous. People, conscientious people, are not easy to guide. They don't reject everything, but they don't accept everything either. They feel, but they don't let themselves be dominated. True awakening was never a revolution external. It was always an internal adjustment of perception. Maybe now you understand why so many codes were hidden in symbols and not in clear texts. Because symbols cross time without arousing suspicion. They survive to changes in language, culture, and technology. They adapt. But there's something they don't manage to cross intact. Consciousness awakens. When you see it, you can no longer unsee. When he recognizes it, he doesn't react the same way. That's the real breaking point. Nothing said here requires blind belief. It just requires honest observation. Please note how certain symbols still arouse immediate reverence. Like certain narratives, they seem untouchable. How some structures seem eternal. Always ask yourself, what is this trying to make me feel? Because feeling precedes decision, and decision shapes destiny, individual and collective. If this video made something move inside you, don't ignore it. It's not fear. It is perception, if reorganizing. And now comes the most important part. The invisible power has always counted on the automatic silence of the masses. But there is another type of silence. Conscious silence. The one where you notice before our act. This silence does not obey. He chooses. I want to make you one last invitation. Nothing to believe here. It's to watch more. Question more. Feel less urgency to react. If this message touched something in you, sign up and follow us. Not out of habit, but out of choice. Because this journey, it's not about finding out who controls the world. It's about deciding who controls you. And now, the question that remains has no immediate answer. It echoes. If the symbols shape the world for centuries, what happens when a generation begins to see them consciously? Does power change form? Or will he? Does it simply lose its effect? Maybe what we call awakening is not acquiring something, new but remembers something old, a forgotten ability to choose clearly. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that the soul has not yet forgot?